Hello, one and all. Bienvenue à tous. If you're turning in live, thanks for making the time for us in your busy day. If you're watching this on YouTube later, thanks for stopping by. However you're watching, welcome to Postmedia's second season of Driving into the Future Roundtables, where today we'll discuss how the price of both gasoline and batteries will affect the mobility industry of the future. I'm David Booth, and I'm the senior writer of Driving.ca. The world is on the cusp of a global energy crisis, making today's panel on how gas pricing will affect the future of mobility absolutely essential viewing. Pump prices are already heading towards $2 a litre in Canada. It could easily go higher. Omicron has taken a temporary bout of oil's recent resurgence, but it almost seems inevitable it would soon hit $100 a barrel and perhaps even more. What will that do to the price of gasoline? How will it affect the auto industry? And will the 75% of Canadians that have bought a truck or SUV in the last few years react to $200 fill-ups? More importantly, will that, as many economists have predicted, create a surge in demand for electric vehicles and their lower running cost? Will stratospheric pump prices be the impetus for mainstream consumers to shop at EVs? And what will any surge in demand do for EV pricing? Will electric vehicles finally become affordable, or will the demand for minerals essential to battery construction see an increase in the cost of electrification? Helping us answer these questions is Adam Rosenzweig, managing partner of Goring and Rosenzweig, Dan McTeague, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy, Stephen Beattie, Vice President, Corporate Secretary of Toyota Canada, and David Adams, CEO of Global Automakers of Canada. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we start the proceedings, let me welcome all our viewers and inform them that we will be trying to answer some of your questions at the end of the discussion. However, there are so many truly good questions, we won't be getting to them all today. So if you could, please post your questions in this Friday's Motormouth column, and we'll get to all of them then. Well, gentlemen, what a time to have having a discussion on the price of gas. And in fact, we seem to be on the verge of another oil crisis, this one due to a shortage of multiple forms of energy, not just oil. But before we get to that, we need to understand how we got into this mess and exactly where all the money we pump into our cars goes. So Dan, we caused quite a stir when we recently wrote that gas was going to $2 a litre. To help the viewers understand pump pricing, why don't you walk us through how gas pricing is determined in Canada and how that can add up to $2 a litre?
Well, David, thank you for that introduction, and great to be here with such an august group of panelists. Look, gasoline prices, obviously a big issue, big topic, not just in the politics, but for every consumer in this country, since it affects pretty much the price of everything that we consume, everything that we use, not just in Canada, but around the world. Of late, of course, as you mentioned, the Omicron has sort of put a bit of a temporary dent into the rise of oil, but for Canadians who have been accustomed throughout COVID to $1 a litre or less, pushing to $1.50, as we saw in the period from August until pretty much the second week of November, has been really a take notice moment, I think, for all of us. The question is, where will it go from here? And it has a lot to do with the geopolitics, but it also has to do with the cross-section of policies, particularly policies ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance policies, on disinvestment in hydrocarbons like natural gas and oil. It also has to do with structural changes, political changes, not building pipelines, not having effective means in which to get products to market, much less be able to respond to what has been a dramatic increase in demand for just about everything. I mean, we talk about supply chains, and that is an issue, obviously not just a labor issue, but we also look at gasoline and energy prices, which at the very time in which they're needed the most, there is less of. Put in perspective, one simple top of mind fact. Prior to the pandemic, the United States, which was the number one producer of oil in the world prior to February 2020 was producing just short of 13 million barrels a day domestically. Although it consumes 20 million, it could count on reliable countries like Canada and others to fulfill the backlog. What we've seen is the United States has dropped from 13 million barrels of production a day to about 11.4 million at best. I see that the Energy Information Agency has just confirmed that number less than half an hour ago. What it means is that there is an undersupply of product, and there's a number of reasons for that, and that's leading to much higher prices. At the same time, here in Canada, we have policies that are in place that are going to increase the price of fuel, and these are really a deliberate policy, whether that be carbon taxes, which will increase, as we know, by 2.5 cents roughly a year until 2023, at which point they increase by 3 cents. And then what I refer to as the second carbon tax, the clean fuel standard, although it may not come in one fall swoop on December 1st of 2022, we are going to see what amounts to, judging by the BC low carbon fuel standard and the clean fuel standard they have in that province, pretty much the only model we have in Canada. That's an additional 16 cents a liter plus HST, GST, TQS. So anywhere from 5% to 15%, depending where you are in Canada. What that means is that energy prices will inevitably have to rise, whether they happen in 2022, where I believe we will reach $100 or more oil. I suspect that the $2 a liter oil isn't that far away. And it's, of course, one other factor, which I'll add, the Canadian dollar. In the past, when we saw oil prices rise, the Canadian dollar relative to its U.S. Counterpart, by which we model, by which we value all of our commodities, whether they're made here in Canada or not, all of those are priced in the U.S. dollar. Unfortunately, the Canadian dollar continues to lag, and as a result, our purchasing power, including that of gasoline, continues to fall behind. $2 a liter gasoline isn't just a notion; it's quite likely the possibility we're looking at over the next couple of years.
Thanks a lot. Thanks very much, Dan. Adam, thanks so much for joining us. And an even bigger thank you for correctly predicting that oil was going to be in short supply a year ago. Everyone else was claiming that there would be a glut for the foreseeable future. So we got quite a big scoop on your prediction. Thank you very much. So can you tell us why you thought oil was going to boom when everyone else saw a long bear market? And more importantly, why don't you give us a quick walkthrough of how we got there? And perhaps more importantly, again, where do you think it will be going in the next year or two?
Absolutely. And thanks so much for having me here today. This is really looking forward to this conversation. To give the viewers and listeners a little bit of perspective and to really understand just how dramatic the last 12, 18 months have been, consider this. A year ago, at the worst of COVID in April of 2020, oil prices in the US went negative. That was clearly something that had never happened in the history of energy. But even if you take the month-end price for crude, it was $20 a barrel. And if you look at LNG pricing for most of deliveries into Asia or Europe, and that would be natural gas delivered by ship, imported natural gas, that got as low as $1.40 per million cubic feet. And the units are not important. What is important is that represented the cheapest energy on a real dollar basis, adjusted for inflation, the cheapest energy that was ever sold on the planet. Fast forward a year, and we have that same natural gas prices that were being sold into Asia and Europe for $1.40 are now being sold for as high as $35 an MMCF, which, to put it in oil terms, that's $200 to $250 per barrel crude oil. That's the most expensive energy that's ever been sold on the planet. And so in 12 short months or 18 short months or what have you, we've gone from the cheapest energy prices to the most expensive energy prices. Now, how can that be? For something that's so central to our lives as energy, whether it be gas, oil, or even, which we're not talking about today, but even coal prices have surged. How can that be? And the issue is really that, and this is what we saw last year, and it's what we continue to see, the short term was being driven by demand, and it was being driven by COVID-related shutdowns. We weren't driving, we weren't flying, we weren't moving around, and energy demand really took a big hit in the worst of 2020. But we figured that demand would rebound, whether it was a year, whether it was 2 years, it would be in what we consider the short term. The medium and the longer term, though, are dominated by supply trends that have been in place for a decade or more. And those are much harder to turn. And COVID just accelerated everything quite dramatically there. So if you go back over the last decade, the United States has really been the only non-OPEC country that's seen material production growth over the last decade. Canada has seen some as well. The rest of the non-OPEC world is actually down, so that net outside of the US, there's really been no net growth over the last year. So it's all come from the US, it's all come from the shales. And we started to see the shales beginning to give way actually before COVID because of a lack of spending, and most importantly, because we had drilled out the best tier one areas in those shale plays. So that's true on gas, it's true on oil. And then with COVID, what you saw was a huge slashing of budgets even further. And they're nowhere near an area now that can support growth. And going forward, we just don't see that supply coming back online. So it's for a bunch of reasons. It's for the reasons that were mentioned earlier. There's a feeling that going forward, we're not going to need fossil fuels. Everything will be renewable, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, at length here today. And there's also a feeling from an environmental perspective that these energy companies are sort of tripping over themselves, trying to distance themselves from hydrocarbons, which is, of course, their core business. And so you see big companies like Exxon, Chevron, Shell, you see smaller companies as well, all very reluctant, if not, frankly, divesting of their fossil fuel business. And all of that has a huge impact on supply. So the demand is back now. 2022, we're likely going to have an all-time record high oil demand year. We've already had certain months of 2021 that have seen records. We've had new records in the United States, in China, in India, the top 3 oil-consuming countries. And so demand is coming back, but the supply ship is going to take a lot longer to right.
Could we see $150 oil?
So, I would have said a year ago that maybe $100 oil would have been, an area where certain companies might be able to make some projects work. But now what we've seen in the last year, I would say that number, believe it or not, is $200 or higher. And I know that sounds crazy, but just consider this. All of the deep water offshore projects, everything outside of the United States that has been, very important to backfill declining legacy oil production around the world. That's all the domain of the Exxons and the Chevrons of the world. And they're under attack now. They have activist investors that are on their board. They're pushing them to actively divest of those projects. Believe it or not, Exxon even announced that they wouldn't be sanctioning a new natural gas project, even though if you really sort of study the market, that natural gas would go to replace coal in Vietnam and other parts of Asia. So it would be good for CO2, but still, they said no. The outlook here over the next 10 years on a non-OPEC ex-shale basis is looking really, really dismal. And the shales just don't have enough tier one acres to be able to fill in that gap. So whereas a year ago, I might have said, $100 oil would get Exxon and Chevron reinvigorated on an international basis, they're not going to touch this business now for the next 5 to 10 years, if ever again. And I think that number could easily spike to $200 a barrel. I know that sounds crazy, but keep in mind, natural gas prices, when you adjust them, because they're quoted in different units, but when you adjust them to an oil equivalent basis, we're about $230 per barrel this past fall. And that's not even in the cold part of the winter. So I think we are woefully underestimating what this new energy cycle is going to look like. And I think it's here already.
Well, thanks for scaring the pants off us. Thank you very much. One thing's for sure, Stephen, we live in interesting times. On the one hand, gas prices are skyrocketing and ZEV mandates are looming. On the other, consumers want ever larger and more powerful vehicles. How can we assimilate those two needs? Does a simple switch to battery power really solve the problem of cleaning up the automotive industry?
Okay, so David, I hate to admit it, but I learned how to drive back in the 70s. And one of the things that we knew at the time was that there were going to be repeated oil shocks, and people lined up at gas pumps. And here's what made Toyota a success in North America was to build small, very fuel efficient vehicles at a time when the industry to that point had been building larger and larger land yachts. I think the one thing that we can count on, if energy prices shoot up at the same time that environmental mandates continue to move us to ever cleaner vehicles, is that consumers are going to look at their monthly budget and make some rational decisions about what to do next. One of which will be to use less energy, no matter what they do, and that is to look in the marketplace and determine what vehicles provide the best, rate of return for them and performance. So, it may be smaller vehicles, it may be it may be hybrids, it could be battery electric vehicles in the right set of circumstances. It might be hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, but it's all ultimately going to come down to that question of, do I want to pay more for the technology in the car, or do I want to pay more for the energy? What do I have better control over? And I would argue that for the most part, you have better control over energy. That having been said, the problem when you look at electric vehicles is that there's a mindset today that you can simply replace the existing vehicles that are being chosen by consumers. In other words, big trucks and SUVs with battery power, and that somehow is the magic elixir that solves everything. The problem, of course, is they're very heavy vehicles, and no matter how far you drive them, they're using a lot of material resources to go into the battery packs, but they're also using a lot of energy simply to move the vehicle around. So I think there's some very tough questions that have to be answered in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, David. Stephen's mentioned how he thinks the pump prices will affect consumers in the short term. How do you think it'll affect automakers in the short term? Domestic automakers already depend on pickups and SUVs for all their profitability. Heck, Ford doesn't even make a passenger car except the Mustang. So how will consumers react to this reality? And then will they actually go to the small cars? And will the manufacturers be able to set them up with those small cars? Are people going to start dumping their pickups? Will we be able to pick up an F-150 at a discount fairly soon because of the fuel crisis? Where are we going with this?
I guess I would start off by saying you're probably not going to pick up an F-150 at a discount anytime soon, regardless, simply because some of the other challenges we have in the industry right now, which are certainly all the supply constraints that we've heard about from the chip crisis onwards, which are limiting inventory. But I mean, really, the proposition that we have right now is last month, I think it was about 83% of the purchases that were made were on the light truck side of the business as opposed to the passenger side of the business. So what we've had manufacturers transitioning their production fleets over into, as you alluded to, into that segment of the industry where people are buying vehicles. So gas prices, and certainly Adam or Dan could speak to this better than I can, there's a certain elasticity around gas prices from the extent of how high do gas prices really need to go before somebody is convinced to say, well, okay, I'm going to buy a smaller vehicle, for instance. And my understanding, again, we can talk about this, Dan and Adam, but you have to get to a fairly high level. It's not just a few cents here, a few cents there. You're probably talking $1 or more per liter to drive some substantive change. I guess you could say in the short term, well, that's something for, as Stephen alluded to, for consumers to consider in terms of looking at making the jump to electrification. But one of the other issues you want to get into, I know as well, is price of batteries and when we're going to have cost parity there. And what does that mean? And there's a lot of promises out there, a lot of demand out there where governments want to take us. And might be nice to have the vehicles, but I'm not sure that we have the infrastructure equation sorted out yet, which is important for everybody considering an EV.
Thanks so much. So, Dan, I'm going to challenge your giant brain internal calculator. Adam scared us with $200 a barrel oil. If it really hits $200 a barrel, what are we going to be paying at the price at the pumps at that time?
Well, look, David has pointed out the elasticity of demand, and the price does have an impact at some stage. But to an earlier point, governments are really truly intending on forcing prices to $2 a liter. $200 a barrel oil would probably, depending on the strength of the Canadian dollar, be more like $2.50 a liter in a worst case scenario. Look, if just a month ago, gasoline prices in Newfoundland were selling for $1.65, if during the summer it was $1.75 in Vancouver, it wouldn't be hard to see a scenario where $200 oil would add in of itself at least $1.15 to $1.20, and assuming the Canadian dollar responds, which it won't and isn't likely to do. But make no mistake, it is the intention of policymakers, with or without understanding the fundamentals of the dynamics of economics. The best cure to high prices is high prices. People tend to slow down their consumption, except if governments suddenly jam in an extra 50 to 60 cents a liter, which is the intention of both the ultimate increases in carbon taxes, which I think will end at $170 a ton by 2030, and then the clean fuel standard, which of course I call the second carbon tax, adds perhaps as much as an additional 16 to 20 cents a liter plus HST. I think if Adam's saying $200 oil, $2.50 a liter wouldn't be extraordinary, out of the realm of possibility, particularly because it is buttressed deliberately by public policy.
Well, okay. Thanks for scaring the pants off us again. Okay, Adam, how long does this energy crunch last? And what do the alternatives look like? Proponents of EVs have long contended that higher gas prices will push people into EVs, which they want, especially since they predict prices of batteries are going to decline even further. But is that decline of pricing in batteries realistic? If demand is going to surge to something like 50% of all cars sold in 2030, and I'll remind people that's only 9 years from now, what does that do to the cost of raw materials? Will, as so many people claim, batteries be cheaper with the economies of scale that are coming? Or will demand for so many electric cars push battery prices even higher? Thoughts, Adam?
I think it's the most important question, and I think it's the most important topic. And what I'm going to share with you today is really something I haven't heard anyone else talk about, and I haven't heard people put it quite in this way. I think the view that you just said is widely held by a lot of people, whether it's policymakers or investors or the general public, that you sort of have these two competing technologies. One is fossil fuel based, whether it's transportation in cars or whether it's electricity generation and for our power. And then you have the sort of energy transition, which is renewables, wind, solar, and lithium ion powered electric vehicles. And they sort of exist in these two completely independent silos. And the price of one is going to go up and down, and the price of the other is going to go up and down. And I think most people view that the price of the renewables is going to continue to fall, according to some type of, Moore's law. I've heard different types of theories put forward that we're just getting better and better at manufacturing all these, so the costs will go down and down and down. And the costs of traditional energy, I think most people just didn't even think of that as recently as 12 months ago. And now they're assuming that that's only going to go up and up and up. And so at some point, it's just going to drive further adoption. But here's the question that I would ask. And like I said, I've not heard anyone put it quite this way. What is the biggest input to both wind, solar, and lithium ion batteries? The biggest input cost to all of them is energy. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that over the last 10 years, oil prices topped out at 145 in 2008, and they fell to $20. Natural gas went from 16 to $1.40. Coal fell 90+%. Uranium went from 150 down to 18. And over that 10-year period where every form of energy fell 80 to 90%, you had this massive proliferation of wind, solar, and electric vehicles. I don't think that's a coincidence. The energy price fell because of investment that had happened in the decade prior. The number one input cost to all of these things fell. And as a result of that, people are now extrapolating that trend. And that's the most dangerous thing that you can do, is to extrapolate the trend. 2 years ago, the trend that everyone extrapolated was that the shale would continue to pump forever. Now we're starting to see that roll over and slow down. The other trend that people now think will happen forever is that renewables and lithium ion and electric vehicle prices will continue to fall forever. Nobody has really dug in to why a windmill per kilowatt hour has fallen 80 to 90% over the last decade. Most people think that it has to do with technology. It has to do with the fact that cement, steel, all the raw materials fell quite dramatically because the energy cost to mine them, manufacture them, and then assemble them fell. What do these technologies look like in a world where energy prices are moving higher and where energy is in short supply? Because these are all extremely energy hungry businesses.
Whoops.
Did you lose my camera, I think?
Yeah, just keep talking.
So I think, when you look at the price of lithium ion batteries in particular, and I think that is really of most concern when we're talking about electric vehicles here, and we're talking about the rollout of electric vehicles, the price of lithium ion batteries have fallen, from over $1,000 a kilowatt hour, $1,200 a kilowatt hour, down to about 140. And we 2 years ago said that we think that most of that is one time in nature, probably can't be replicated. For your viewers and listeners, $100 a kilowatt hour, that's the magic number where it starts to get cost competitive with internal combustion engines. But if all of a sudden your energy costs start to move higher, what does that do to your cost of lithium? What does it do to your cost of cobalt? To say nothing of the depletion problem in those minerals. So I think actually battery prices have probably bottomed here. And believe it or not, even Bloomberg New Energy, which is the champion for electric vehicles, in the quietest announcement I've ever heard them make, because they're very loud about everything that they say, earlier this week said that 2022 lithium ion battery prices were going to be up year on year. Nobody had that projection in their models as of 2 years ago. In fact, everyone thought that it would be accelerating declines. So I think things are changing now. Like everything else with COVID, the big debate is whether it's transitory or structural. Is it just a COVID-related issue and then it'll start declining again? I would argue no. I would argue that we're in a new world here. Energy prices are going higher, and so things that require a lot of energy are going to become more expensive.
Well, thanks very much. The discussion that was kind of scary, even though the screen went blank. Wow. Stephen, if Dan and Adam are right, and again, I want to reiterate that both of their recent predictions have been spot on. Where does that leave a global automaker like Toyota? How do you, as one of the world's largest automakers, thread the needle between high fuel pricing on one side and expensive batteries on the other? What exactly do you do to provide consumers with a cheaper alternative for their total cost of ownership?
Well, I think there are two answers to that, David. One is energy diversity, making sure that we're driving as many technologies into the market as possible so that consumers have choices about how to move forward. But as I was saying earlier, the big thing is the industry really needs to look hard at efficiency. So that means using less fuel to move vehicles around. It means using less electricity to move electric vehicles around. And choosing products in a way that optimizes their capabilities. So let me give you an example. If consumers are wanting to make the shift to SUVs and pickup trucks, and that seems to be the case, then you need to make sure that the vehicles they're moving into are far more efficient in their use of energy than the vehicles they've moved out of. And one of the better examples that I have for you is that when we brought out our most recent version of the Toyota Highlander, it's a three-row SUV, but it had, in the hybrid version, better fuel economy than our previous subcompact car. So it's possible to drive those types of efficiency gains. And the benefit, specifically in that case, is that if you take a big, heavy vehicle and you hybridize it, you can gain those types of efficiencies. You don't necessarily gain the same energy efficiency by turning that into a fully electric vehicle. And so it's the right technology for the right application. It is understanding that maybe battery electric vehicles are best deployed in short range urban applications where you're not carrying too much battery capacity with you. And so you don't have the upfront costs of the battery, and nor do you have the energy costs of moving it around. And it's making sure that, as we're looking at other parts of the transportation sector, like heavy duty, that hydrogen and other technologies come into play. Because if you try to push everything through the eye of the needle, it's battery electric, here's what I know. You'll create scarcity, you will create over-reliance on a single technology, and something's bound to fail.
Yeah, a multiple propulsion mechanism system would seem to be the ultimate goal, though one thinks that, how would I say it, that, with the push to just go into one singular focus with batteries, it's going to disturb the market.
So if I can just respond to that for a second, here's the problem. As human beings, we all want simple answers to complex problems.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to say that a battery electric vehicle, because it has no tailpipe emissions, is a clean vehicle. That sort of smooths over a lot of the other math that goes into the vehicle. But just because you can build the vehicle doesn't mean that the infrastructure will support it, that all of the use cases are right for it, or that it makes sense to push it through government policy. So the approach that's being taken to try to deal with carbon emissions right now is one of the most expensive approaches that could possibly be adopted by government. But it's simple, it's clear, it's easy to understand for somebody who isn't paying a lot of attention. And so I think that's where the debate is right now. And, it's going to be discussions like this that I think will begin to alert people to some of those other complexities.
Thanks very much. David, so things are getting complicated. Indeed, I suspect that these are very trying times indeed for any automaker mapping out its future. Do they ramp up production of electric cars in the hope that battery prices don't increase? Do they up their research into internal combustion efficiency, even though the future of gas engines seems bleak? And how do you see the consumers getting out from under this squeeze? Are consumers going to drive less? Will they drive less if gas prices keep rising? Will they buy smaller cars? What are we going to see in the future? Oops, did we lose David?
No, there, you brought me back now, I think. Every manufacturer is in a slightly different position in terms of how they've decided that they're going to come to market. But I think in terms of just taking out a basic scenario between the existing market players and the new entrants, you've got new entrants that are coming to the market with a completely different business model. And when I say new entrants, I mean completely electric vehicle manufacturers like Tesla, like Rivian, like myriad of others that are about to enter the marketplace. So, they've set up their business model. I think it's a much more difficult challenge for the existing automakers as they go through that calculus, as you suggest, in terms of how do I transition my business knowing where it needs to go towards decarbonization. I say decarbonization as opposed to electrification for some of the very reasons that Stephen just alluded to, because electrification and emissions reduction are not the same thing, although too many people equate them to the same thing. So you can have a situation, as we have now in some areas in Canada, where we've got more EVs on the road than ever, but transportation emissions are still going up. So what we really need to do is look at what problem are we trying to solve. If we're trying to solve an emissions problem, then that requires the energy diversity approach, I think, that Stephen referred to. And I always look at things. I'm driving an electric vehicle right now, but infrastructure is one of the key issues. And we've proven that out through some of the survey work that we've done with Litre in Canada, and others have done. It always ranks up at the top list of why consumers don't adopt an EV or consider adopting an EV is the infrastructure. It's both where they charge it if they don't have a garage, and also what is the infrastructure like if I need to go on a longer trip beyond the range of my vehicle. But I think going back to your original question, it's a perilous time to be an automaker, I think, right now, knowing what the policy environment is, driving towards net zero, and trying to work your model mix such that you can make that transition out of traditional internal combustion engine vehicles and into some form of electrified vehicle.
Thanks very much. That was very concise. Dan, the most common concern from all our readers is, what is the government going to do to replace all the taxes it collects on gasoline at the pumps if we go fully electric? Why don't you remind us how much is collected and where it goes, and what our government's going to do when cars don't run on fossil fuels anymore?
It varies by the year, but with a country that uses about 70 million liters of gasoline every year, a multiplier of about 40 cents a liter, federal, provincial, and even municipal taxes for things like public transit, you're looking at a net loss of at least $5 billion. That's with a B. It may sound like nothing compared to the amount of spending that we've seen the government undertake very recently. But let me put it in perspective. That would mean that the federal government's financial and fiscal room to do certain things, including subsidies to manufacturing EVs, subsidies to consumers to buy EVs, many of whom would not buy those things, could very well be imperiled or at least circumscribed. And I think that's one of the main reasons why someone is going to have to come up with an alternative. British Columbia, I think, once again, one of the three provinces I know that now has mandates to get rid of all internal combustion engine sales by 2035. Again, arbitrary numbers picked out of thin air, may make great political sense, as all my panelists have sort of alluded to in various ways. But perhaps not practical. Losing that kind of revenue would also displace some of the realities about the country. The fact is, equalization, transfer payments, all of these things make a lot of headway in terms of our ability to make ends meet, and to lose that kind of annual budgetary revenue would, I think, have disastrous impact for governments at a time precisely when they're having to pay back a lot of debt. Let me also mention, all this debate would be very different if we were just talking about the Windsor to Quebec corridor. Take that very important area, very populous area, out of the equation, and you are suddenly left with a lot of Canadians who are left out of this debate. And for that reason, the federal government's ability to suddenly, and the provincial governments, to forego billions of dollars in revenue, and that's just if they go to internal combustion engines. What happens to the oil and gas sector? Still, in all due respect to David, still our number one generator of wealth in this country. If you suddenly see a dramatic decline, not that it won't happen, or that it has not already happened, what about lost revenues in the oil and gas sector? That too could have an impact well beyond the $5 billion. The calculus could be easily double that.
Oh, well, high gas prices, loss of $5 or $10 billion. Yeah. I don't know where to invest my money these days. Adam, the truest adage in business is to follow the money. And you being our money guy, where is all this investment in EVs going to take us? I mean, a simple switch to batteries doesn't seem to get us very far. As Stephen alluded, I mean, just switching from to a pickup truck with a huge battery isn't going to completely solve the situation. Yet consumers seem wedded to pickups and huge SUVs. If they stick with their monster trucks and simply switch from gasoline to lithium ion, won't that just exacerbate the high cost of batteries that you've already mentioned?
Absolutely. I think, here's something to think about, kind of bigger picture. And if you want to follow the money and ask where money is being put to work today and where the investment returns are going to be, the money is being poured into things like wind, solar, and lithium ion, both lithium ion vehicle companies, obviously big incumbents like Tesla, but new startups that don't even have products yet. And then the battery technology companies themselves, which, believe it or not, you would sort of think that the battery industry was, fairly steady Eddie and conservative and full of, very scientific, quiet people. It ends up, nothing could be further from the truth. It's full of promoters. It's full of, unbelievable speculations. It's sort of like, the mining industry in Vancouver, the battery industry puts it to shame. So what I would say is, there's so much money that's being poured into that space that ultimately will be impaired and written off because the technologies just are not there. They're promising huge things. The valuations behind them are through the roof. And at the same time, the valuations on the traditional energy industry, whether it be the oil industry, the gas industry, the nuclear industry, although that's been rallying a little bit recently, is still incredibly undervalued. We're not putting money to work in those spaces. We're not encouraging the companies to invest in their businesses. To the extent that these guys are making really good profits now as energy prices have moved higher, they're giving that all back to shareholders in the form of dividends. No one's investing in their business. So none of those incentives are the right way. And if you want to talk about incentives, I think here's sort of an interesting way to think about it. If you look back throughout history, it's been almost impossible to find an example where we as a society have adopted a new technology to displace an old technology where the new technology is much, much less energy efficient. The energetics are much worse. And I can give you a lot of really great examples of that. But to me, my favorite example, because there's also this other sort of misconception that big technological changes take huge periods of time and that we'll get there eventually. But think about this. For several hundred years, the most energy or the only way to cross the Atlantic was by ship. And by the early part of the 20th century, the best ocean liners, the best Cunard ocean liners were achieving energy efficiencies that had been by far the best that they had seen in their history. I think they'd come down 70 or 80% in terms of energy per passenger mile. And Boeing, introduced its 707. They brought in the jet age. And the total amount of kilojoules or total energy, one is obviously jet fuel and the other was using diesel and coal, to bring a passenger across the Atlantic fell by a factor of 5. So it fell by, went from, I think, 25 kilojoules per person to 5. And within 10 years, jet travel had displaced 90% of ocean lining travel across the Atlantic, right? So it happened extremely quickly. Then somebody came along and they said, well, look, it seems like maybe time is what people are after. And they brought forward the Concorde. And so by 1970, you had the Concorde and it cut the travel time in half. It was an unbelievable feat of engineering. I mean, if you talk from an engineer's perspective, it was a marvel compared to the traditional jetliners that we're still using today. However, it was 3 times as energy intensive per passenger mile than the 707. And so it just never could gain adoption. And everyone said, well, maybe we need, bigger uptake and we need bigger, economies of scale. But it wasn't that. It was the fact that you were trying to jam in a new technology that was much, much inferior on an energy basis than the old technology. That's what electric vehicles are. I'm sorry to say it. I know I'm going to probably get a lot of ire from people. But when you factor in the cost to manufacture that lithium-ion battery, to mine the materials, and then to assemble it, it's really energy intensive, particularly when you then use renewable electricity to power it. Because I think we all agree in our heart of hearts, if we're not admitting it, that if we're going to have an EV fleet and it's all going to be powered by coal, we should probably just stick with the current internal combustion engines we have today. So it needs to be renewable backed. And if you have renewable backed power, where the renewable needs to be backed up by batteries so that we don't lose power at night or when there's no wind like happened in the UK, and then you dispatch that power over all new infrastructure, put it in your EV where you've built a 100 kilowatt hour battery, which is unbelievably energy intensive. You're not saving any energy. In fact, you're spending anywhere between 30 and 50% more than if you just went internal combustion. And so the question I would put, to the panel and to Stephen in particular, if given trillions of dollars in 30 years, do you think that you could improve the energy efficiency of the internal combustion engine? By how much? Because then it puts the EV even that much farther out of reach. And it's a very difficult proposition. It moves the emissions out of the tailpipe, makes people feel good, but people just don't understand what goes into it. And it's really, 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 really tough.
So Adam, to your point, some companies have said that they'll stop developing internal combustion engines. We're not one of them. And, we believe that you have to drive that efficiency. We believe that today, for the vast majority of our customers, at least, a hybrid makes the best sense because it uses fewer battery cells but gains radical improvement in efficiency. And frankly, as you move forward, as I said, I think that energy diversity model is going to be very important for picking the right energy for the right mode of transportation. But if you're right, and oil prices are, as a result of government policy or shortages in conventional sources, whatever it may be that drives those spikes. I just want to remind everybody that we've got 20 odd million light duty vehicles on Canadian roads. So when the government talks about 50% sales by 2030, they're only talking about the fewer than 2 million vehicles we sell every year, not the total on-road fleet. So if energy prices get to a certain magic number, then synthetic fuels and other options are also on the table. And frankly, I really wouldn't count out the traditional energy producers, because I think they've got the knowledge and the technology and the approach to the market to be able to bring, a much broader set of solutions to the marketplace. So anyway, it's going to be a very fascinating future, and I think it would be a mistake to bet on a single horse.
And I should just point out, Stephen, we've done a lot of independent work on our end, and while lithium-ion electric vehicles are very tricky in the framework that I'm talking about, hybrids are very, very, very efficient. They make a lot of sense, and you're using the right electric motor for the right part of that voyage and things of that nature. And so net, I think I agree with you and Toyota's approach with hybrids wholeheartedly.
Thank you.
My God, who would have thought that Toyota could do something right? Shock, horror. David, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you for a prediction. You're in touch with every automaker in the land. A year ago, it all seemed so predictable, a seemingly orderly transition from fossil fuels to renewables. If both pricing of fuel and the cost of batteries remain prohibitive, what does that do to the plan to convert to 100% EVs in Canada by sales by 2035? Does it speed things up? Does it slow them down? Or do we just batten down the hatches and hope these price increases are short-lived?
Well, I think what we're looking at, or need to recognize at the offset, is that is that all of this is being driven by government policy. And the governments have indicated that they want to have, in Canada, the Liberals have suggested that they want to have 50% of the vehicles that are sold be zero-emission vehicles by 2030, and then 100% by 2035. Some provinces have even more aggressive targets than that. But I think in terms of looking at the transition from ICE vehicles to EVs, zero-emission vehicles, as I said earlier, it's a challenging transition, and I think ultimately the consumer is the arbiter in all of this, and they're going to be the ones that make the decision in terms of what vehicle they look at purchasing. So governments we've seen it in provinces so far, and federal government has suggested that they're going to put in place a national zero-emission vehicle mandate, which would essentially force auto manufacturers to sell a certain percentage of zero-emission vehicles. We can make them, but we have to ensure that the customer's there to purchase those vehicles as well. And I think beyond that, as I've alluded to before in my comments, we need to ensure that the infrastructure is there, and also that consumers, if they are going to adopt this technology, understand exactly what they're getting into and purchasing an electric vehicle, because it's not the same experience currently as driving an ICE vehicle. And rather than talking about cost parity, I think in some ways what we need to talk about is consumer convenience parity with the EV and the ICE vehicle. What I mean by that is our consumers that are transitioning into EVs are looking at it through the lens of what has my experience been with an ICE vehicle. And a lot of people aren't prepared to, aside from early adopters, aren't prepared to move away from that type of an experience as they transition into a new form of mobility. So one quick example would be, and we see this cited a number of times, is how long does it take you to charge your EV if you're not charging at home? If you can charge your EV at home, great. But if you're traveling up north somewhere, you need to stop somewhere to charge your EV. You're used to, in a gas vehicle, being able to do that in 5 minutes. That's not the current proposition that you can undertake in an electric vehicle. And I speak from experience because I've been driving an electric vehicle for the last number of months, and I could tell you a few stories, but I love the vehicle. The charging experience is less than exemplary, that's for sure.
Thanks very much. Guys, we're running out of time, so quick answers to these last two questions. Dan, how much is a liter of gas going to cost at the end of 2022?
Well, average prices right now are about $1.34. They went up 4 cents today. They're going up another 2 tomorrow. I think a 140, 142 looks like the magic number. Unlike copper, which is going to go through the roof, probably doubling because we just don't have enough of it out there.
But for say December 31st, 2022, what price do you predict for that?
Oh, sorry, 2022. I had 2021 in my head, in my mind. You're really jumping ahead. I think we're looking at 170, 175. Realistically, a lot of elements within that. But generally speaking, I don't see a scenario where oil plummets. No one has spare barrels of oil. That includes Saudi Arabia, that includes Russia, and even if you throw Iran into the mix, which some say, well, the nuclear deal goes through, we get them back to the bargaining table. They're already selling that oil anyway. So there's no one out there producing extra, and no one has money to produce extra, especially where it counts. The United States, still the world's largest consumer of oil.
Adam, what will be the price of a kilowatt hour of battery in your mind, say in 5 years, 2025?
Well, there's a saying that, you can have a price and a date, but you shouldn't put the two together when you make a prediction. So I think my bold prediction is going to be that this year is the low point in lithium ion battery prices. And that was 135, according to Bloomberg NEF. And the big question that everyone's sort of tripping over themselves is how many years until $100 per kilowatt hour, which is the parity number. And people, have numbers coming sooner and sooner and sooner and sooner. I'm going to take the complete other side, and I'm going to say that 135 is the low, and we're actually going to see prices move a lot higher. So by 2025, it could be back up to 150, 160. No one has really tested what it costs to make these things with higher energy prices. Could be a lot higher than that, but I think 150, 160.
Okay. Stephen, next year, 2022, all new year, what percentage of Toyotas sold in Canada will be hybrids?
So, let me finish off with this year. We're running a little north of 25% of our sales being alternative powertrain. So that would include the hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and fuel cell vehicles. Our plan between now and 2025 is to get up to half of our sales in that space. But again, it's going to be a mix of different types of technologies. And if the objective here is reducing carbon, we can do it. If the objective is to turn everybody into a battery electric driver in Canada, man, those are long odds.
Thanks very much. David, you're going to get the first of the reader questions. John Bernard asks, does the government intend to continue subsidizing electric vehicles indefinitely?
No, I don't think any government intends to subsidize electric vehicles indefinitely. And it somewhat rests on what Adam was saying about when we think we might get to price parity. And there's a wide range amongst the experts in terms of when that might be. But I think you need to at least incentivize the vehicle until you get close to that price parity amount. And that we're looking at probably like for another, I would think at least 5 years anyway, in terms of incentives. And if you look at it in terms of the targets that governments are asking society really to meet, that becomes a very expensive proposition very quickly.
This is my favorite question of all from all the readers. And Dan, you're our metric guy, so this one's for you. Ayaz, who's a chief investment officer, asks, comparing gas prices at the pump to electricity prices to charge an EV is not an apples to apples comparison in my mind, because the carbon cost to manufacture an EV is higher than the carbon cost to manufacture an IC vehicle. We've already covered that. So his question is to this panel, is there a need for a better comparison metric, and what might that look like?
Well, it has to be dynamic. It has to be evolving, because the current metric would say, tailpipe emissions, get nothing for it, while EVs, no one takes into consideration, as we've discussed, how it is made, the process and the efficiency of that vehicle, and of course, what powers it. beyond the fact that electrification and making EVs, if everyone had one, I'm not sure we would have I know we would not have the electrical infrastructure to put in place. But that building that out, that electrical infrastructure, whether it is the electrical boxes on our streets, which have to be upgraded, the copper that we need, the minerals, the mines that have to be used. I sense that we need to look perhaps a little bit more on both the outcomes. What does it cost to build a conventional ICE vehicle, and the improvements that it has been making over the years, and that I've seen, that you've seen, David, that Stephen has seen. I mean, the reality, I think, for many is that the current metric of which is very much a public quick look at this. Oh, I love EVs. They're great. They don't use gas, and I don't have to worry about being fleeced at the pumps, is quite different than when you put it in against the idea of what the total emissions are in the life cycle of the vehicle. And I think that's critical. And we do need a new metric, and I think we need a new discussion, because right now the pendulum is clearly in one camp, and that is those who believe that EVs are the modern miracle, and anything else is less than that and unnecessary and should be shunned, according to, of course, the narrative of our politicians these days.
Stephen, Laurel Ann is obviously shopping for a car and asks, what will be the reduction in carbon dioxide from driving gasoline car versus hybrid versus EV? Is there any round numbers you can offer her?
Well, no, because it depends both on the vehicle itself and on the driving cycle that it's in. So, for example, if I were to put the same vehicle into taxi use versus general consumer use, you can have very different numbers, coming from that. I will say that the best easy way of understanding it is to look at the government's fuel economy numbers, because they convert those both for fuel and for an e-fuel number, which allows you to make a comparison for the amount of energy used to move the vehicle around. Beyond that, the energy used in manufacturing, those numbers aren't easy to get at, and we may have to rethink the way that we do those calculations and make them available to the public. What I would say in any event is this: any new vehicle that you buy is likely to be more efficient than the vehicle that you replace on the road, and that ultimately is the issue that we have to come to grips with. We've got a lot of old vehicles on the road in Canada, and if we make it too expensive to replace them, they're going to stay there longer with a bigger environmental impact from the tailpipe. So we got to look at what's the rational way of responding to this, and but in any event, I recommend looking at a hybrid if you want to make the immediate jump to something that's more efficient, lower emission, and we got lots of them. So we'd certainly welcome you to a Toyota dealership.
Adam, we only got a couple of minutes left, but this one's surely for you. Frank, another investment officer, but this time retired, asks which metal, copper, lithium, cobalt, etc., will be most effective by the surge of electric vehicles we're predicting.
Well, I think probably the answer is copper. And the reason for that is copper is really quite necessary in any of the electrification plans that we're talking about. So whether you're talking, whether you go hydrogen fuel cell, whether you go lithium ion battery, whether you stay fossil fuels and just talk about electrifying huge parts of India that remain unelectrified, the demand story for copper, I think, is very, very, very strong. People ask me all the time, what's the substitute for copper? And the truth is there's very little substitute for copper in the ways that we use it today, which is to say, in electricity distribution in that last mile, not the high tension power lines, which are all aluminum, but that last bit into the neighborhoods, that all has to be copper, and that's not changing anytime soon. So when we think about all the different metals, what I think is the most interesting about copper is that copper has the most outcomes where it wins, which isn't to say, that there might be other metals that are really small and really esoteric and niche minerals and markets that could go up 10, 20, 30 fold. but in the most number of potential outcomes, copper does well. So I think in this move towards more electrification, regardless of whether it includes vehicles or not, which I don't think it ultimately will, but no matter what, going forward, I think copper has a very bright future on the demand side. And supply of copper is very, very challenged. We've just gone through a decade where there's been only 1 or 2 major new copper mine discoveries. It's the lowest in history. And obviously, without going too much into the mining business, first you need a discovery, then you have a proven reserve, and then you have the production. So if you didn't have the discoveries in the last 10 years, it's going to start to impact production, and that's happening already.
Thanks very much. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Adam, Dan, Stephen, and Dave for making this such an interesting discussion. And again, to repeat myself, scaring the pants off us. Most importantly, I'd like to thank all our viewers for taking the time to join us on Driving into the Future. And I'd like to remind everyone that if you have a question, please use the comment section of this Friday's Motormouth column, and we will attempt to answer them all to the best of our abilities. Again, thanks to everybody. And that's it for Driving into the Future.